Last night's primary races made at least one thing clear. The battle for the soul and direction of the Democratic Party is far from settled. Progressives notched wins in some states, while more moderate establishment Democrats held on to their grip in others. As our next guest argues, the issue isn't necessarily about party identification, but rather about the major disruptive change some voters want to see in the political system. And joining me now is G. Elliott Morris, co-founder of the polling and elections website 50+1 and author of the Strength in Numbers newsletter on Substack. Elliott, good to see you. So let's just start with what last night's primary results tell you about how voters are doing and feeling right now.
Well, thanks for having me on. I do think your introduction really makes this clear for us. There's, in some states, you have Francesca Hong losing to Crowley, for example, a progressive losing to a moderate. But then next door in Minnesota, you have a progressive, Peggy Flanagan, beating her moderate so-called challenger by 30 points, 20 points. And this, I think, helps us understand that this divide in the Democratic Party really isn't about progressive versus moderate. The big thing that's driving change within the Democratic Party and also for the midterm election, as that headline you showed at the beginning of the segment shows, is whether or not someone says that the system needs major disruptive changes, or whether or not someone feels that the political system, might be working well for them or might be working good enough that these so-called major disruptive changes aren't needed. And when I look at polling data, I find that this single question you can ask voters, do you think the system needs major disruptive changes, is about as good a predictor as whether or not someone likes candidates like Hong and Flanagan or Zoran Mamdani and Ocasio-Cortez in New York, as whether or not they call themselves liberal or moderate.
I'm curious what you make of where Francesca Hong may have gone wrong then, because she was out there saying that she wanted to disrupt everything from the stopping a data center proliferation and leading the way on a moratorium to wage-related matters and affordability being a key part of her message. And do you think part of what went wrong for her may be that she didn't really have the support of other heavyweight progressive voices who are pushing for disruption? So Flanagan had the support of Elizabeth Warren and Senator Sanders, for example, and, Hong never really got that support from the big names.
Well, the first rule in American political punditry is to dramatically oversimplify voters' decisions into being about their ideology, progressive versus moderate in the case of the Democratic Party. But that doesn't seem to be the case here. If you look at Hong's campaign, for example, it seems like probably where she went wrong is not having high elected office compared to her challengers, and having some pretty big missteps in her public statements in the past, stuff that came back to bite her, of course, being weaponized against her. In American politics today, candidate quality is also very important, and it exists somewhat separately of a person's ideology. So it can be as simple as she didn't run a good enough campaign to overcome her challengers who really consolidated against her in those final weeks. But let's not overstate it, right? She still came within a half a percentage point of winning that election. That is still a pretty big nominal victory for the left, even if she underperforms expectations based on polls.
Yeah, and she ran a very interesting sort of door-to-door crisscrossing the state campaign that I think people across the spectrum have learned from, just in terms of energizing voters and listening to them and being ahead on issues like the data centers one that we're seeing is a bipartisan matter now. And on that, I guess when you kind of think about these anti-system voters, do you think they're a sort of special phenomenon on the left right now for the Democratic Party, or actually are you seeing that across the board?
Yeah, we find anti-system sentiment is pretty pervasive in American politics. If you ask someone whether or not the country's on the right track for them, and they say about 80% no, the country needs major systematic changes, compared to things are actually going just fine for me. And this is a particularly strong sentiment on the left, but it's not only on the left. Moderate Democrats, Republicans, and independents, also a majority of them say the political system needs major disruptive changes. So, in our political science understanding of voters, we can think of people as being persuaded by our or candidates' liberal, conservative positions, whether or not they're progressive or moderate or MAGA. But we can also think of them as being persuaded by whether or not a candidate is saying look, the system's not working for you. Like they're putting these data centers up in Wisconsin at the cost of your water supply, or prices are out of control, like your previous guests were talking about. And that sentiment runs beyond or orthogonal to a voter's liberal conservative position, and actually can bring them in. So just to say, our polling finds that moderate Americans who call themselves anti-system say that they will, or who express anti-system attitudes, say they'll vote for Democrats by 50 points in the midterms this November. A moderate group you would not expect otherwise to be 50 points in the Democratic column. So it is a very powerful predictor of behavior.